She got the phone call while she was in labor, 9 centimeters, about to meet her daughter, and her phone rang. Let me say that again, because I needed to land the way it landed on me the first time I understood what had actually happened. A woman was in a hospital bed, 9 centimeters dilated, about to deliver her first child, and her phone rang, and it was her boss, and he fired her while she was in labor over the phone, with a nurse standing right there who later signed a statement about it. He thought he was being clever. Fire her while she's distracted, while she's overwhelmed, exhausted, holding a newborn, running on no sleep and no fight. He calculated that a woman with a 3-day-old baby wouldn't have the strength to take a man like him to court. He was wrong about her strength, badly wrong. But her strength isn't even what ended him. What ended him is that he wrote it down, the whole plan, in text messages to a man he trusted. And that man's phone ended up open on my bench. 90 seconds after I started reading those messages aloud, a man who owns 6 restaurants stopped believing he was going to win. I'm going to read you the exact words, but first you need to meet the woman he tried to erase, because she is the reason this case stayed under my skin long after the gavel came down. Her name was Daniela Fuentes, 29 years old. She had worked at a restaurant, part of a small local chain of 6, for 6 years, starting as a server at 23 and working her way up to shift manager by 26. Understand what that climb actually means, because people who've never done it don't. She started carrying plates. She learned the kitchen, the register, the ordering, the scheduling, the 1,000 small crises of a restaurant on a Friday night, a walk-in cooler that fails, a server who quits mid-shift, a health inspector at the door. She learned all of it from the bottom, and she got good enough that they handed her the keys. She closed that restaurant more nights than the owner had set foot in it in a year. She trained half the current staff. When something broke, they called Daniela, not Brett. Her employee reviews were in the file, and they were the kind managers dream about. Reliable, natural leader, the single biggest reason our turnover is low. And one of them, written and signed by the same man who would later call her hospital room to fire her, used one specific word. I'm quoting the document exactly. He called her irreplaceable. He wrote that word in her official review 14 months before he replaced her while she was in the middle of giving birth to her first child. Hold on to that word. It comes back. And when it does, it's going to mean something very different than he intended. The owner's name was Brett Mackey, 44, 6 restaurants, a boat he posted about constantly, and the specific management philosophy of a man who believes his employees are lucky to have him. Daniela had told him she was pregnant early in her 2nd trimester. She'd arranged her leave. She trained a temporary replacement herself, trained the very person who would cover for her leave, because she was that kind of manager, the kind who makes sure the place runs smoothly even when she isn't there to run it. And on the day her daughter was born, Brett Mackey called the hospital room and told her the company was moving in a different direction, and her position was no longer available. No severance, no notice, on her due date, in her hospital bed. Here's what Brett Mackey was actually doing, and why he thought he'd get away with it. Firing a pregnant employee or an employee on maternity leave because of the pregnancy is illegal. Flatly, unambiguously illegal. Brett knew that. Brett wasn't stupid. So he didn't say, "You're fired for being pregnant." He said, "We're moving in a different direction." He created a paper-thin story about restructuring and business needs. the same hollow language every employer reaches for when they're doing something they know they can't say out loud. On paper, it looked almost defensible, a restructuring, a business decision, unfortunate timing. Here's the thing about pretexts, though. The fake reasons employers build to cover illegal ones. They almost always have the same fatal flaw, and once you've seen enough of them, you can spot it from across a courtroom. A pretext has to be constructed, which means it leaves fingerprints. Someone has to decide on the fake reason, communicate it, coordinate the story, and every one of those steps is a chance to create exactly the evidence the pretext was meant to hide. The lie needs a paper trail to stay consistent, and that paper trail is the noose. Brett Mackey built a beautiful pretext. He just built it in writing, with witnesses, in language a 12-year-old could decode. That's the version his attorney, a polished man named Grant Ellison, presented in my courtroom. Ms. Fuentes' position had been eliminated as part of a genuine reorganization. The timing relative to her delivery was, in Ellison's words, an unfortunate coincidence, nothing more. There was no evidence, he said, that the pregnancy had anything to do with the decision. No evidence. He actually said that. No evidence. He said it because he didn't know what Daniela's attorney was holding. Daniela arrived at the hearing with her daughter, 3 months old, asleep in a carrier against her chest, because Daniela could not afford childcare. She'd been unemployed since the birth, since the phone call, and a woman fired on her due date does not have a cushion of savings to fall back on. No paycheck coming in for 3 months, a newborn who needed everything, and a lawsuit she wasn't even sure she could win. She'd found a legal aid attorney, a sharp, underpaid young man named Marcus Webb, who had looked at her case for about 10 minutes and seen exactly what it was, and taken it, because some cases make you angry in the way that makes you useful. So she sat in my courtroom holding her sleeping baby, and I watched Brett Mackey not look at either of them. Not once. He wore an expensive casual blazer and the expression of a man enduring a minor inconvenience. He checked his watch twice in the first 10 minutes. A man who plainly felt he had somewhere better to be than the reckoning he had personally scheduled for himself. I have watched a lot of people fail to grasp the seriousness of the room they're standing in. Brett Mackey was among the worst. He had no idea. He genuinely believed he was going to be home by lunch. Grant Ellison ran the restructuring story cleanly for about 15 minutes, and it held. On the surface, it held, because the surface was all Brett had ever intended anyone to see. Then Marcus Webb stood up and asked the court's permission to enter a set of text messages into evidence. The messages had come from the personal phone of a man named Danny Ruiz, the assistant manager at Daniela's restaurant, Brett's second in command, the person Brett trusted enough to be honest with. Danny Ruiz had provided the messages voluntarily. I'll tell you why in a moment, because his reason is its own small story about decency. I granted permission, and I opened the messages, and I read them into the record. The first one was from Brett to Danny, sent 7 weeks before Daniela's due date. Brett wrote, "We need to figure out the Daniela situation before the baby. Once she's on leave, it gets complicated legally." Danny wrote back, "She's our best manager, though. What situation?" Brett wrote, "The situation where I don't want to hold a job for someone who's going to be distracted by a kid for the next 18 years. Find me a reason, performance, whatever, build a file." Danny wrote, "There's nothing in her performance. She's the best we've got. You literally called her irreplaceable in her last review." Brett wrote, "Then we restructure, eliminate the position. She can't sue over a restructure. Talk to Grant about how to word it." And then the one that ended him, sent the day before Daniela went into labor. Brett wrote, "Perfect timing, actually. If it happens while she's in the hospital, she'll be too wrecked to lawyer up." Do it fast, do it clean, moving in a different direction. Done. Too wrecked to lawyer up. Too wrecked to lawyer up. I read that sentence out loud in my courtroom, slowly, every word. And then I set the phone down on the bench and I looked at Brett Mackey. And for a moment, I'll be honest with you, I did not trust myself to speak. There are sentences that reach up off a page and take the air out of a room, no matter how many years you've spent reading them. That was one of them. I looked at Daniela, 3 months postpartum, holding the very baby whose birth this man had used as a tactical window. And then I looked back at him and I let the silence do some work, because some sentences deserve to hang in the air a while before anyone responds to them. The room was silent. Grant Ellison was staring at his own notes with the expression of a man who has just realized his client lied to him, because Ellison had stood up and said, "No evidence, and unfortunate coincidence," and he'd said it in good faith, not knowing his client had confessed the entire scheme in writing, weeks in advance, in language so plain it needed no interpretation. I want to tell you what I felt, because it wasn't professional detachment. It was something closer to grief, with a hard edge of anger running underneath it. The specific feeling of watching in cold documentary evidence exactly how a person decides another person doesn't count. Because Daniela Fuentes had trained her own replacement. She had done everything right. 6 years, glowing reviews, arranged her leave, prepared the restaurant to run without her. She was irreplaceable in writing. And this man had sat at his desk 7 weeks before her baby was born and decided in cold text that her becoming a mother made her a situation to be managed, a problem to be worded carefully, a person to be timed for maximum helplessness. If it happens while she's in the hospital, she'll be too wrecked to lawyer up. He had planned his cruelty around the most vulnerable moment of her life, and he had congratulated himself on the efficiency of it. Now let me tell you about Danny Ruiz, because he's the reason any of this saw daylight. Danny Ruiz still worked for Brett Mackey when he handed over those messages. He was risking his own job to do it. Brett could have fired him, and probably would, and Danny knew it. He did it anyway. In the statement he provided, Danny said something simple. He said Daniela had trained him, that when he started, terrified and useless, she'd stayed late for weeks teaching him the job with a patience nobody had ever shown him. He said when Brett told him to build a file on her, he'd refused, and he'd kept the messages because some instinct told him he might need them someday. He said, "She had my back for 6 years. She trained me when I was useless and everybody else had written me off. I wasn't going to help him do this to her. Not for being pregnant, not for anything. I'd rather find another job than be the guy who helped him. I'd rather find another job than be that." There are 2 men in this story. One owned 6 restaurants and planned a woman's firing around her labor. The other made restaurant wages and risked them to do the right thing. I'll let you decide which one was actually successful at life. And before I move on, I want to say something about Brett Mackey that complicates the easy version, because the easy version is too easy. I don't think Brett woke up one day and chose to be cruel. I think he'd spent 20 years being told that good business means treating people as numbers, that sentiment is weakness, that the winners are the ones who make the hard call. Somewhere in there, the part of him that would have been horrified to fire a woman in labor got quietly renovated into the part that called it perfect timing. Nobody is born texting "too wrecked to lawyer up." You get built into that, one rationalization at a time, by a world that keeps rewarding you for it. That is not a defense. He earned every consequence he got, and I gave him all of them. But it's worth understanding because the machinery that produced Brett Mackey is running in a lot of offices, and it doesn't feel like cruelty from the inside. It feels like being smart. I ruled. The text messages did not just support Daniela's claim. They were, functionally, a written confession to pregnancy discrimination and retaliation. Brett Mackey had documented his own intent to fabricate a pretext, find me a reason, build a file. His awareness that the real reason was one he couldn't say out loud. Once she's on leave, it gets complicated legally. And his deliberate timing to exploit her vulnerability, too wrecked to lawyer up, I found for Daniela Fuentes completely. Lost wages from the date of termination, awarded. Reinstatement at her election, though I suspected she'd sooner walk into traffic than back into Brett Mackey's restaurant, and she'd earned the right to that choice. Damages for the wrongful termination, awarded at the top of the range the law allows for this kind of harm, because the conduct wasn't just wrong, it was deliberate, premeditated, and cruel in exactly the way these protections exist to punish. And I referred the documented scheme, including the attempt to fabricate a false performance file, for further review. The total was substantial, deep into six figures, more, I'd wager, than the boat Brett Mackey posted about every summer. But it stays true, case after case. The money is never the part that matters most. Brett Mackey can earn money back. What he can't earn back is the thing that's now permanent in the record, that he planned, in writing, to discard a mother at the moment of her greatest vulnerability, and a court of law wrote down that he was exactly what the evidence said he was. I turned to Daniela Fuentes, who was holding her daughter, who had woken and was making the small sounds babies make. I said, Miss Fuentes, 6 years ago, you started as a server. You became the person who held that restaurant together. The reason, in your own employer's written words, that the turnover stayed low. The manager who trained the very people testifying in your favor today. You did everything right. And when you became a mother, a man decided that made you disposable. And he planned the moment of your greatest joy as the moment to discard you. I said he was wrong about you in every way a person can be wrong. He called you irreplaceable and then tried to prove himself a liar. He assumed motherhood made you weak. You walked into a courtroom 3 months postpartum holding your daughter and beat a man with 6 restaurants and a paid attorney. I'd say the record is clear about which of you was irreplaceable. Daniela Fuentes didn't cry. She looked down at her daughter and she adjusted the blanket and she said quietly, I just didn't want her to grow up thinking you're supposed to let people do that to you. Her daughter, 3 months old, already, without knowing it, the reason her mother had refused to disappear, the reason an exhausted, unemployed, postpartum woman had walked into a courtroom to fight a man with 6 restaurants instead of quietly accepting that this is just how the world works, because it isn't just how the world works. Not always, not that day. The whole room heard it. Nobody moved. Even the baby had gone quiet, as if she'd understood something the adults were still catching up to. Let me be honest with you, the way I've tried to be in all of these. Daniela Fuentes won because one assistant manager kept the receipts and risked his job to hand them over. Take Danny Ruiz out of this story, and it's a very different one. It's restructuring and unfortunate coincidence, and a woman with a newborn who couldn't prove what she knew in her bones was true. She'd have lost, not because she was wrong, because the truth without evidence is just a feeling, and Brett Mackey had built his whole plan on her having no evidence. Most of the Brett Mackeys win. That's the hard truth under this. Most of the time, the text messages don't exist, or the person who has them stays quiet to protect their own paycheck, and the cruelty works exactly as designed. These stories exist so the people who usually get discarded quietly get to be the ones we remember instead. If Daniela's story moved you, the best thing you can do is talk about it. Leave a comment. Tell someone. Let it travel. Stories like hers spread when people feel something and pass it on. And there's someone out there being told we're moving in a different direction right now who needs to know it's worth standing up. And if you want to follow along with more of these, you're welcome to become a member of the channel. It's just a way to stay close to the work and hear the next story a little sooner. No pressure either way. Watching, caring, and sharing is already the whole thing. Now tell me something real in the comments. Brett Mackey wrote, "Build me a file 7 weeks before he needed it. He planned it. That's what gets me. Not the cruelty in the moment, but the cruelty scheduled in advance, in cold text, by a man who felt clever doing it." So here's my question. Have you ever watched someone in power decide a person was disposable and get away with it? Or were you that person? Tell me. I have a feeling this comment section is about to be full of people who were called irreplaceable right up until the moment they got inconvenient. Brett Mackey fired a woman in a hospital bed and thought the timing made him safe. He forgot the one rule that undoes clever people every time. Clever people write things down, and the phone he confessed on wasn't even hers. It belonged to the one person in his restaurant who still knew the difference between keeping a job and keeping his soul. Danny Ruiz chose the soul. And a 3-month-old baby, asleep against her mother's chest, will grow up in a world where, at least once, in at least one courtroom, that choice was the one that won. Dramatization for storytelling and education, not legal advice or reporting.